I'm Mike Pothier from the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, and this morning it's my pleasure to be speaking to Mr. Kimi Makwetu, the Auditor-General of South Africa, coming towards the end of his term of office, which will be at the end of November. Mr. Makwetu, we're very grateful to you for giving us your time. I know how busy you are in these last few months, having to travel up and down the country, visiting your different offices, saying goodbye to everybody. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us, Mike.
There may be some guests with us listening out there who are not 100% familiar with what the Auditor General and the institution, the Auditor General's office, actually does. Can you give us a brief rundown of your mandate?
No, thank you very much, Mike, for that first question. Mike, as you had said earlier on, revenue gets collected in the country from different sources. Some of those sources are the direct taxes that we pay. Others are indirect taxes like value-added tax, as well as many other sources of revenue, whether it is from fuel levy or any other such revenue that is due to the state. So in anticipation of the need for all of that money to be accounted for, the Constitution of the Republic in section 213 prescribes that all monies collected on behalf of the state shall be deposited into a national revenue fund. So that's the starting point, that there's a national revenue fund into which all revenue due to the state shall be deposited. But after that has happened, because of what the public institutions represent, that is now government, and all other institutions, including state-owned entities and municipalities, all of them shall receive part of their funding needs to do the things that they need to do for all of us as citizens, whether it is the maintenance, building of roads, whether it is to fund education, whether it is to fund healthcare, human settlements, and any of those things that we often refer to as public goods. So all public goods are then funded out of that revenue that has been collected. And of course, if also you look at the same section 213, it also prescribes that all withdrawals from the National Revenue Fund shall be based on the authority of an Act of Parliament, which means that if you are to deliver and provide water, if you are to provide basic services in local government, there ought to be a law of Parliament that authorizes the withdrawal of monies from the National Revenue Fund. And there's possibly one or two other exceptions that are allowed for from a withdrawal's point of view, and among others, that is to pay for the elected representatives. All 400 members of Parliament are paid for directly from the National Revenue Fund in essence, as well as other elected representatives. So here you've got a picture of a situation where revenue has come, and part of that revenue has been committed to various projects. Many of them are annual projects, and other projects are multi-year projects that must be funded out of the same pool of national resources. Now, these responsibilities, as you know, get entrusted in the hands of a number of individuals. Many of them have got some level of training. Others do not have the requisite level of training required for them to be able to handle this money transparently, as well as to account for it when the time comes for them to account for it. So the same Constitution then in section 188 develops a mandate that needs to be attached to an independent institution, which institution is in chapter 9 of the Constitution called the Auditor-General. And the job of our institution, therefore, is to assist in promoting disciplines of transparency as this money gets handled across the country every year. It enables us to also promote principles of accountability in the manner in which this money gets handled. So we've got, therefore, existence as an audit office across all the 9 provinces in the country to attempt to come to a conclusion as to whether those that have been entrusted with handling these public funds, have they done it in accordance with the prescripts that govern financial management. Those prescripts are predominantly developed to promote transparency and to promote accountability. So our teams, which are about 3,500 in total across the whole country, spread all 9 provinces, have now got a responsibility every year to do an independent evaluation of each of the institutions that had the responsibility to spend this money. And this responsibility and this evaluation process must lead to a conclusion that the auditors have made independent of those people who are spending this money. And that's where we come in, and hence we express opinions like clean audits in certain cases, and I'll explain that further later on, as well as we express opinions like disclaimed opinions. When we say an opinion is disclaimed, we mean that even as the auditors came to examine the accounting records, they left none the wiser as to the quality and the relevance of evidence supporting the transactions undertaken. While on the other extreme, when we speak about clean audits, which are generally referred to as unqualified with no findings, those are situations where people have done their level best to live up to the disciplines and principles of transparency and accountability. And that's really where we come in, and that's what we do.
Thank you. For many people, I suppose the stereotype of an accountant and an auditor is somebody who sits quietly behind a desk, totting up figures and examining financial statements and so on. But in your most recent annual report for 2018-2019, you refer to the fact that you have been executing your mandate, and I'll quote, in an increasingly difficult and at times dangerous environment. What are these difficulties and dangers that you and your team are facing?
Just following up on the introductory comments I made in response to your first question, Mike, you will appreciate that where we come in as an audit office, and we come in as an independent assessor of how monies have been spent, you can already see that we are not always going to be welcome, because there will be some people whose intentions were at variance with what the Constitution prescribes when it comes to issues of accountability and transparency. So our teams, because of the level of training that they are exposed to, as well as the level of instruction they get from us who are behind the scenes in terms of the areas of focus, because remember, the risk attached to any institution when it comes to this money change all the time. Sometimes you'll get people who are generally cooperative, who are able to lead you to where the audit evidence is. And in some environments, you'll find people who philosophize about all sorts of things without providing you the evidence. And others will probably run away and make themselves unavailable when you are looking for this evidence. Now, the strength of an audit sits on 2 levels. When you do an audit, you could be getting towards a place where there's a little bit of uncertainty as to what has happened to the money that the auditor is examining. In some instances, there's also a level of disagreement, meaning that the auditors and the people being audited disagree on a particular interpretation of a provision of a statute. Some of those things, sometimes as we make the inquiries, they lead us to want to dig much deeper than what we've done before, because it's the nature of risk. When you've got a heightened level of risk in any environment as an auditor, the best way to mitigate it is to see a lot more evidence to support the transactions that have been entered into. So if I claim that I spent 20 million in the Department of Health to procure all sorts of things for medical care, all the auditors are looking for is evidence to suggest that. They are looking for authority to get that expenditure to be processed and spent as agreed. In certain cases, some people feel it is very difficult for them to produce evidence. In some cases, that evidence is not there. So when the auditors insist, some of them, they tend to personalize it.
Yeah.
Make it sound like it is this auditor now that thinks that they are much cleverer than they were before. And therefore, I will try all sorts of tricks to try and deflect their attention, either by phoning them anonymously and suggesting that I know where you stay, all of those things. These are some of those tricks when people know that you are actually headed in the right direction when it comes to the audit evidence. And we've seen a lot of that in a number of the audits that we do. And that was the basis for that, because you basically, as an auditor, are mitigating the risk of monies going astray in the interest of what the Constitution wants done, versus somebody who has done something else or even put that money in their pocket in certain cases. And that's where the tension comes in.
Right. It kind of leads into the next question in a way. As I mentioned earlier, you started off in 2007 when you were appointed as the Deputy Auditor General, and then in 2013 you became Auditor General. So you've been at the highest level of the institution throughout the period that we now associate with state capture. But unlike a number of other institutions of state, the AG's office has emerged out of that with its reputation very much intact. So the question is, how did you, and I mean you as an institution, not you personally so much, how did you avoid being captured during that period?
Wow, Mike, that sounds like a very difficult maths exam question. I'm going to try. Perhaps when I start, I'll say that I will leave the rest of the historical analysis of what happened in that period to historians. And for now, I'll focus on what we as auditors did.
Yeah.
You know, as an audit institution, we are entrusted with this responsibility, which is a huge responsibility. And we cannot do it. If you look at the Public Audit Act, it says that the Auditor-General, the person, must. But we know that we cannot do this through one individual, because it carries with it the responsibility of in excess of 1,000 audits of financial statements. And now the way we recruit people into our institution, we are predominantly biased towards a lot of people who sign up to the Code of Professional Conduct as chartered accountants. And we know that it's not a foolproof test, because there are many chartered accountants who in the same breath have facilitated the levels of state capture as we have come to know it. But in our case, in the audit institution, one of the key things that we elevated right up front was for each of the people in the leadership roles that they play, to make sure that the tone that the leadership sets is replicated across the division where they are taking leadership responsibility for. And by that I mean, when we speak about ethics, when we engage on how we need to present ourselves as state auditors, there are certain disciplines that we need to observe. And many of them are not just textbook-based. They are also about what is Kimi Makwetu doing? How is he coming across when he deals with some of these matters in the public domain? And I think what is important for us is that we have invested a lot in making sure that our people take guidance from how we go about doing the work. An example of this would be, if somebody wanted me as a person to change an audit opinion because it was going to put the spotlight on monies that were missing on their side, we have a discipline in our office that suggests that Kimi Makwetu, even though he is the apex leader of the organization, does not have individual authority to do that. Because the examination of audit evidence is delegated in the hands of a multiple team of people who, in their own individual space, bring forth the audit evidence that leads to the final conclusion of an audit. So in a way, you could say that we have developed our systems and identified the regular review of our people's positions in essence. For example, they must sign up to a very transparent process of declaring their assets, of declaring sources of income regularly, as well as declaring areas of potential conflict of interest that they might have. And I think for us, in our case in the institution, is that if a particular audit was supposed to be a disclaimed audit opinion, it becomes a disclaimed audit opinion because the audit evidence suggests so. We do not delegate the responsibility to a big chief to be the one with whom somebody might negotiate, some of the difficulties that might attach to them if they get an adverse opinion. We have an interdependent approach with regards to the teams of people that drive these audits. This means that if somebody in the team were to behave differently, they also know that the risk is not only to the institution, but it is to them. Because should we find out that they were responsible for working for somebody in order to achieve a different conclusion, they also stand to lose in terms of their own membership of the Institute of Chartered Accountants. And at an early stage in their career, they know there's a huge risk of them being stripped of the license to operate as an accountant, as an auditor. So I don't think that is a foolproof solution to it, but we try. We try and make sure that we insulate our teams from being unnecessarily abused by those that might want to get a different outcome. But secondly, Mike, we've also tried to observe the other discipline that is about not being, what do you call it? The word just escaped me now. But in any case, we protect our staff by ensuring that they are auditors and they are subscribed to the code of conduct. But on top of that, they know that by being an auditor, you are not a celebrity. You are somebody that carries out a constitutional responsibility. And I think all of that rubs across all of our teams for knowing that we are in this together in order to elevate the risks for our government, but we also carry personal risk, because should you do something that will expose you to people who might want to give you some money in order to express a different opinion, you stand to lose big time in terms of your own standing as well. But the other part of it is the ongoing advocacy that we do in the organization on a regular basis. We don't rely only on the fact that we've got policies on ethics, but we act on them. We deal with them. When somebody strays, we show them the door quickly if there's something that might embellish the image of the institution. And of course, even at my personal level as AG, because I often assume the public posture in regards to our work, the last thing I always make sure is evident even to all the staff as we engage with them, is that I want to be the last person to bring headlines to any daily newspaper which may point to some significant wrongdoing in the organization. And I think a lot of our people that have come through the ranks have signed up to that discipline and that value proposition.
So good internal structures, strong disciplines, a sense of professionalism. You didn't mention so much the question of leadership, I think, but I reckon we can all appreciate that probably one of the key factors also has been the leadership that you've exercised over the organization in recent years. So that also would have been a protective factor against state capture, I've got no doubt. Corruption, you obviously come across any number of instances of corruption or suspected corruption, irregular expenditure, even just straightforward theft and looting of state resources as you go about the business of auditing those hundreds of state entities. I think you said it was around about 1,000 different audits that are carried out. There have been a lot of suggestions recently that we need in this country a specialist agency that would focus on combating corruption, but also on recovering the proceeds of corruption, possibly an agency like your own and the public protector and so on at the level of a constitutional Chapter 9 institution. an anti-corruption or an integrity commission, perhaps some people call it. Do you have views on that? Do you think that would be a useful innovation for us?
Mike, this proposition has been out in the public domain for a while. I've tracked it in most instances when I read contributions by Advocate Hoffman, among others. I think he's a proponent of this view over a number of years. I remember he even surfaced it when we were processing the public commentary at the time that we were processing the amendment to the Public Audit Act, which has culminated into the additional powers. I have no fault with that proposition necessarily. However, what I do think, though, is important that the country needs to embrace is the need for comprehensive multidisciplinary capabilities if one is to disrupt persistent corruption. I think there's a need, there's no doubt about that. Because the systems of yesteryears are now also being overtaken by the digitized environment that we are operating in, which no doubt will need people who are able to respond to the digital risks. Because now we are not all by ourselves anymore. We are on a webinar with about 60 odd people. And we probably just on faith hope that they are the people that were intended to be on the webinar, as an example. So it calls for very high level awareness, even at the leadership level in public institutions, for the need for strong preventative controls, so that when you are having a conversation like this, documents don't float around and they end up in wrong hands. Because if they end up in wrong hands, you'll find people who will be scouting around these networks looking for ID numbers, which ID numbers could be used inappropriately to try and access funds that are being paid under COVID-19, because they call themselves by all sorts of names. So the nature of the risk changes. Hence, I'm saying that the focus perhaps should be around, do we have a plan for a comprehensive multidisciplinary set of capabilities? If they get to be housed under Chapter 9 of the Constitution, that may well be for a different purpose. But the starting point will be to how do we disrupt and how do we mitigate the risk of so many people who are interested in the monies that get drawn out of the National Revenue Fund, as an example, because it's not only just the money that they take away, but it's the opportunity for people to live under a roof, it's the opportunity for somebody to get access to medical care, is the lost opportunity for somebody who may have benefited from the funds available for education. And so a lot of these things, if they are going to be happening in the digital space, certainly there's no doubt in my mind that a set of multidisciplinary skills will be necessary. We've already evidenced the value of this when we reported on our first report on COVID-19 at the beginning of September, where because of the alertness of the Audit Office to the nature of the risks that we're going to find expression in respect to the funds that were made available, we were able to respond with a combination of forensic expertise, information technology specialists, data analysts, performance auditors, and a whole range of other people that have got these state-of-the-art skills. Now, that is a capabilities housed under one command, if I might put it like that. We did not worry about which department in our units that particular capability must be, as long as we knew that we do have the alertness to the need to be proactive and responsive to the nature of the risks that South Africa faces as a public sector. For me, it's not so much a preoccupation about there must be a large Chapter 9 institution of this or that other kind of architecture. I think what is important is now to realize that so many opportunities as reflected through the State Capture Commission, as reflected through multiple reports coming from different independent agencies, suggest that the preventative attitude to protecting our national resources is not in place. Some of those assets, for example, are no longer in form of money. They are in the form of assets, because we've already spent the money. We now have assets. But if we don't have that approach to dealing with our assets proactively, we sometimes find we paid for these assets, but we're not generating the economic benefit that is expected to flow from these assets. You can think about the Vembe district in Limpopo, where we spent the money, we put in water delivery infrastructure, but we never did the last part of it, and that was to install a reticulation process that will enable people to open the taps and run water. You might argue that that is not necessarily the area of target in terms of the people who commit fraud, but the reality of the situation is that the levels of incompetence in pursuing and implementing government programs are also at a higher level. What they do, they get us into a position where we must budget again for the same thing. Yeah. Or we must come and do maintenance work on an asset that ought to have lasted over its useful term, let's say, of 20 years. Already in year number 7, we are already trying to replace that asset. Why? Because the requisite disciplines of managing our assets and managing our resources are not at the level where they are. Whether that will be answered by some agency in a particular location, or it will be answered by a rigorous analysis of the type of multidisciplinary skills that you need to be able to disrupt those with ill intent, to me, I think, is possibly the area to navigate.
Now, one of the areas in which you work is, of course, municipal audits and auditing the 253, I think it is, municipalities throughout the country. And we've become used to bad news over the years, unfortunately, that very, very few of those municipalities obtain a clean audit. In your municipal audit results for 2018-19, you say that most municipalities are crippled by debt, unable to pay for water, electricity. There's inaccurate and lackluster revenue collection, expenditure that is unauthorized, irregular, fruitless, and wasteful. And yet, you also point out that there are a number of municipalities that do actually perform well, and they do so consistently. And they're not all, as some people believe, in the Western Cape. I want to just read a list to make this clear. You've identified Senqu in the Eastern Cape, Midvaal in Gauteng, Okahlamba in KwaZulu-Natal, the Capricorn District Municipality in Limpopo, the Gatsibanda and the Nkangala District Municipalities in Mpumalanga, and the John Taolo Gatsewe District Municipality in the Northern Cape. Those are some which you gave clean audits to. Now, the obvious question is, or two parts, what is it that sets those municipalities apart from the rest? And why can we not replicate what they're doing correctly in the many others that are performing so poorly?
Let me start with the ones, Mike, that concluded as clean. The common characteristic in many of those municipalities, including the ones you didn't mention in the Western Cape. Maybe let me start with the Western Cape as a start. Way back, I think it was around 2009, the entire province of the Western Cape, as an example, signed up to a program that was driven by the Premier at the time. This program was their normal Premier engagements on a quarterly basis in the province, where the Premier, together with the municipal managers, the mayors, as well as the members of the Executive Council of the Western Cape province, would come together, examine various strategic projects, but one of the key among those was, what is the status of your accounting and financial management records, Mr. Mayor? This was not a question that was directed at the CFOs because they were not present in those meetings. it was municipal managers and mayors from each of those municipalities of that province. And the strategy was to say, there is no way that the weaknesses in the financial management systems will just disappear by themselves without the leadership of that institution taking ownership of those matters. So here was one example in the Western Cape where there was clear leadership, ownership. And of course, it was quite a terrible experience for anybody in those meetings who are still battling with achieving clean audits. And they would be given, say, 2 years or 3 years to navigate the challenges and the difficulties that they encountered towards reporting transparently, as well as making sure they identify chief financial officers who have the requisite technical knowledge and training to be able to manage accounting and financial records. So that's the second issue, to invest in the skills that are required in order for the finance department to respond to matters that will come in a statutory audit. But thirdly, this was not just a once-off in 2009, Mike. It was something that was carried right through that term of the fifth term, if you like, of parliament in the province, as well as in the sixth parliament or the sixth administration was also a feature. So there was a culture that was driven at leadership level. There was also a preoccupation with the need for examining the levels of skill and vacancies that you have in those positions. And over time, if you track the navigation of those municipalities in the Western Cape, many of them achieved these clean outcomes over a period of time. And it was something that they were competing among themselves on, to say that my municipality shall sustain this. And if you look at the history over many of those, I think there are about 13 now that are clean. Many of them have been like that for more than 5 years. Each of those municipalities have been classified as clean for more than 5 years. Now you will realize that one of the things we don't do as an audit office is to examine the qualitative elements behind the numbers, because an audit mandate is about what do the numbers say, what represents those numbers from an evidence point of view. It's not about how did you split the R1 in the city of Cape Town between Khayelitsha, Muizenberg, and Constantia and Manenberg and so on. Yeah. That's not what we mean. And that's the key question we've always been encountering in that province. When people say, look around, when you take off from Cape Town International Airport, you see chalk and cheese. Well, that's not an auditor's preoccupation. That's a preoccupation of those that manage policy development as well as effectiveness of implementation of policies. At the heart of what we do is to test whether the transparent disciplines that give assurance that this money is going towards the things that were planned is the minimum that we do. And that characteristic feature I've described, you will find it in places like Midvaal. Midvaal is right at the center of Gauteng. You've got to go through other municipalities before you get to Midvaal. But Midvaal has adopted similar disciplines. And that's why they've carried a clean audit over a period of time, because they've ensured that if they've got an infrastructure project, they don't leave it as if it was an orphan project. They pursue the objectives that were behind that program, even if they don't have sufficient money to spend on it. But at least they know that they need to account for why are things the way they are, even in their own small municipality. I can say the same with the districts in Mpumalanga. It was Gersibande and Nkangala district. But the funny thing about it is that both of those two districts have got municipalities under them, the component municipalities that make up the district. Yeah. But the funny thing about all of it is that the municipalities, the local municipalities under those districts have probably got the worst forms of financial accountability. And you sometimes wonder what could have been behind it. Why is it that within that district, there are municipalities that do not care about even basic control over your accounts as well as your cash and bank? But notably, you'll also note in these outcomes that Free State and Northwest, among other provinces, do not have a single one of those clean audits, as an example. Many of those municipalities have been falling apart to not have the requisite revenues to continue to operate and to pay for the bills as they fall due. And part of that has also been the neglect that has been observable over a number of years at a level of leadership. And there have been no consequences ultimately over the years, not only to CFOs, but also to those that are required to exercise oversight. They have not been exercising that level of diligence to make sure that projects are completed within the context of their own oversight policies, as well as the monies get reported on as they should. And I think that's really the mixed bag. And hence, we crafted the heading of this report as, if you recall, when we launched it, we said there's not much to go around, yet not the right hands at the till. And that's how we captured the essence of that local government report for the 2019 year, because it was clear that no real accounting and accountability is respected in a number of those that didn't get clean audits. And for many of the ones that got them, is the kind of disciplines that are leadership-led. They are not the kind of stuff that a CFO is going to do, because there are a number of influences that weigh over an institution, some of which come from outside, people who want to be given certain contracts for reasons known to them without following proper processes within the institution. And I think that's what's the defining feature if you want to compare those that are clean versus those that are not.
Mr. Makwetu, for purposes of the interview, I'm going to say thank you very much for those very comprehensive but also frank and straightforward answers to the questions. And just to repeat once again, I think that we're all very grateful to have had you at the top of this organization looking after our money, and we certainly wish you all the best for your future endeavors.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Right, now we will open up the meeting now to everybody else. As I said earlier, it would be good if you can pose your questions and comments in the chat box. I see there's already one question there, and we received a couple of questions in advance of this meeting as well. So I will put those to Mr. Makwetu. I think one of them he has more or less already answered. So please, as I say, either indicate on the screen by raising your hand that you wish to make a question or a comment, or put it into the chat box. I'm going to just pose a question that we received by email beforehand from one of our Parliamentary Portfolio Committee researchers, who asks, are there any plans to ensure that the scope of auditing extends to service delivery information? In other words, that the audits ascertain whether there's been value obtained for the money that's been spent, and whether the money that's been spent has actually brought about a difference in the lives of the people who are supposed to receive the services. I think you may have addressed that in answer to the last question in terms of the qualitative questions, but perhaps you could explain this a little bit further.
No, thanks for that, Mike. Yes, I did, maybe very briefly, but if you look at the scope of an audit, as I explained earlier on, if I run through those issues that I raised in terms of the origins of this mandate through the Constitution, one of the things that we do regularly is to do what we call the regularity audit. Examination of the financial management disciplines, examination of the adherence to prescripts that govern financial management, as well as scrutinizing whether the information contained in the annual reports of departments is valid, accurate, and complete. Now, our cry over the years, if you look at it, has been that nobody really gives much care to address a lot of the recommendations that we raise in our audits. We go to portfolio committees in Parliament, we engage with SCOPA, and we have every single year interactions and interface with all of those committees to bring to their attention the stuff that's broken in the pursuit of managing these finances. So that's what we have been doing all these years. And there's ample evidence out there to show that not much has been done because it's a system that doesn't bring about consequences quickly. Let me use an example. If I was given 20 million rands to spend for a water treatment works plant in a particular locality in the country, and I could not sustain the evidence required by the auditors to justify how I spent that 20 million rands, then I take this 20 million rands evidence to the meeting of council with the expectation that council must act on all the infractions that I've identified during the course of the regularity audit. Let's say I do that and council sits in the meeting and they nod all the time, and then the meeting finishes without them having made a very concrete commitment. Sometimes they make a concrete commitment but never carry out that commitment subsequently. So that's the regularity audit, which is predominantly what we do now. So let's take the other example where someone says, let's extend the scope to look at value for money. If we apply our value for money considerations, which is the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness with which that particular wastewater treatment plant was delivered. The reality, Mike, is the audience is the same. That other report that you are going to surface, you are still going to have to subject it to the same audience, the council. But you would have spent an additional million rands on audit fees. So the point I'm getting to here is, what is important for our system is not so much the extended scope yet. What is important is, to what extent are we diligent in making sure that the recommendations of an audit are carried out and that the consequences for it are also effected? Because once you do that, then you can rest assured, even if you deliver a performance audit, it is going to find similar kind of resonance with those that are charged with governance. So the bottom line is that whichever type of audit we might want to do, and we've got the capability to do many of them, the bottom line, when we assess it, we're saying, but it's the same audience. It's the same people who are exercising the same leadership role. It's not that they want to see this thing in triangular form versus in diagonal form. You know, they will get the same information even though it's broken down differently. Yeah. So I think there's a challenge that we need to address first before we commit additional resources to areas like performance audit. And we've done a couple of value for money audits already, and many of them fell on deaf ears as well. We've already proven that. One of those was to examine the value for money when monies are spent on consultants. That was in 2011. Already we did that report in 2011, where we did a system-wide review of the diligence with which consulting services are managed. This year's report on local government showed us that with all the negative audit outcomes, in addition to the cost of employment of the people in government, we spent an additional 1.2 billion on external service providers. Yeah. There was a value for money audit in 2011, which did not find resonance with those charged with governance. 9 years later, the matter surfaces as even much bigger than what it ever was. So the bottom line here is that you're not going to get any different result with a new framed audit if you are not going to focus on delivering consequences through leadership that does what they have to do. So that's the answer.
Okay, just trying to link that to some of the questions that have come up now in the chat box. You mentioned about leadership, for example, and all the problems at municipal level in particular. There's a question here about whether lifestyle audits should be made mandatory in municipalities that do not get clean audits. And then another question about professionalizing the civil service at local level, at municipal level, what kind of training for councillors do you think could improve the situation?
At the leadership level, Mike, I mean, there's ample evidence coming through, even as we navigate these issues today, that there are quite a number of people who are in leadership positions in various institutions and who accumulate assets and are able to do all sorts of things, even though the declared source of income is the place of employment only. But when you look at and you track the accumulation of assets, you kind of see a growing level of assets that is disproportionate to the declared value that is received from employment. That's the starting point, because it means that the source of funding for many of those assets may be from places that are potentially conflicted, or it may be from places that are not conflicted. If somebody has inherited something and so on and so forth, it is justifiable that they ought to be having a balance sheet with a net asset value, let's say in 2019 of, let's say a net asset value balance sheet of 1 million. But a year later, if that person's net asset value position is 15 million and they remain in the same employment, having received 3 or 4% in annual adjustment, then something is supposed to be looked at, particularly when that person carries responsibilities that interface with others outside of the public service, because that's where the levels of irregular expenditure, among others, start popping up very significantly, because you end up with transactions that are not able to be properly explained in terms of how they were adjudicated or how they were awarded. But on the other side, the very same people who preside over those processes have growing levels of net asset positions at their disposal, despite the fact that they only get 850,000 annual earnings of a chief financial officer. For me, I think that is important, the issue of the lifestyle audits, for it to be done in a way that is potentially uniform in terms of the rules that apply across, so that somebody who wants to carry out or take on a public service role know that part of the transparency considerations that are laid out in our constitution are also going to apply to them. In the same way as when we take on these roles ourselves, we have to lay ourselves bare to people who must examine and scrutinize our own things as well. And I think it must apply to that, because it gives you a sense of confidence that if somebody has made a mistake, then it's a mistake, but it's not a mistake that is accompanied by a deposit of 2.5 million rands into their account. And I think for me, that is what is important. It shouldn't be a retributive process, but it should be a cleansing process that is about elevating disciplines of transparency to those that might be swayed one way or another by others that might have bigger pockets and are prepared to pay, because sometimes they pay knowing that they are going to do a sloppy job of delivering on this project, but they do know that they've got their people who are going to direct contracts to them for as long as the auditors, when they find out about these contracts, nothing might be done by those charged with leadership. So I think a lifestyle audit is a proper intervention that elevates one of the key disciplines of preventative control, because it is one of those disciplines that put a preventative measure in place. And if you step into something that you ought not to have, then at least you will be caught out through this whole exercise of a lifestyle audit. And now in terms of professionalizing the civil service, there are areas, Mike, where we have come across this, when in some municipalities, I can think of an example of 1 or 2, for example, in the Northern Cape, and we were engaging with some of the members of MPEC, and in other provinces as well, where they say openly, look, I was just asked to be a member of MPEC. I'm honestly not too sure exactly what I'm supposed to do. That's what some of them say, you know. which genuinely means that there is an inappropriate match between the expected performance of a particular councillor in an MPEC versus the skill and the competency required to perform that job. So there's no doubt that the likes of the Association of Public Accounts Committees, the Municipal Public Accounts Committees need to invest a lot in their existing resources to make sure that the councillors at least know that on a quarterly basis, if an accounting officer of a municipality is required to submit financial information, if they cannot interpret that information themselves individually or collectively as councillors, the council must be alert to the fact that you can bring somebody who will come and explain those finances to you as council, independent of the municipal manager. And I think there are many ways to enhance the capacity of those people, because we get disappointed when we were expecting that these councillors are the ones who are supposed to mitigate the risk, but sometimes they openly say, sorry, I really do not know what it is that I must look at. If you give me a balance sheet, I just see numbers. I've got absolutely no idea what is the relationship between that item and the other item. Yeah. And whatever item is disclosed in page 49 of the financial statements, I just have no idea exactly what it is. So it is important that that particular area is given focus. There's no shortage of people in all these towns who can go into a council meeting and at the instruction of the council, if the council is rigid about its focus on this matter, to say, you are coming here independent of the municipal manager to come and explain to us on these quarterly accounts, what is the municipal manager telling us? And please tell it to us in English, not in accounting speak. We want to understand it in English so that we can get our head around what are we dealing with. Because among those councillors, there's somebody who has been entrusted with the responsibility to be the MMC for infrastructure. Mm. Now, when you get people elected to councils, they don't submit CVs and say, I have got accounting for non-financial persons as part of my training. They don't, but they get put into roles that they are required to apply themselves differently, but they haven't got the requisite skills. And I'm saying an intervention to try and assist them towards explaining, because then they will know that if that wastewater treatment works has not even started off at a foundation level, but the financial statements say there's already 12 million spent, then you don't need to be an accountant to know that something fishy has happened if 12 million has been spent, but there's not even a foundation in that wastewater treatment works. Because as a councillor, you would know about the lack of the foundation, but you wouldn't know how it is represented in the books. Maybe somebody is claiming to be spending money on that project to the extent of 12 million. Now that's exactly where the interface with those that are skilled ought to come. I hope I've dealt with that one as well.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question that relates to Parliament, and we have with us this morning, I see from the participants list, a number of certainly parliamentary researchers, I think one or two also former and perhaps sitting MPs also. And the question is, can you say something about the role of Parliament in actually utilizing your reports in carrying out their oversight duties? Are you satisfied with what Parliament is doing, how they are making use of the information that you place before them in these reports?
Well, Mike, my experience maybe on this is informed by the number of years that audit reports had been submitted to Parliament. And here's how it works. In a normal year, that is not a COVID year, I mean, this year is an exceptional one, yeah. But in a normal year, at the end of July, the prescripts that govern financial management in the country, the PFMA, require that the audit office must sign all their audit reports by the 31st of July. By the end of September, 6 months after the financial year end, all the departments and entities publicly funded must deposit their annual reports in Parliament. They must table them in Parliament. And once they are tabled in Parliament, what often happens, the Speaker will refer those reports to various portfolio committees for processing. On top of that, there's also the Standing Committee on Public Accounts that deals with issues pertaining to the financial management portion of those annual reports. So there are two elements: the portfolio committee that is responsible for the implementation of programs, the achievement of objectives, the tracking of long-term strategic plans, that type of stuff, many of which get reported on in the annual report. And that is normally accompanied by financial statements with an audit report. Our evidence over the years has been that there has been no shortage of interactions between these portfolio committees and state employees in the form of accounting officers and their teams. They've often interacted with them. They've often highlighted the same issues that we highlight in our audits when they discuss them in SCOPA, or when they discuss the issues of vacancies, for example, in financial positions, if they are in the portfolio committee. So all that public engagement that ought to happen, happens. Now, each committee then submits its recommendations, which then get tabled as a resolution in the House. The House will receive reports from this, that, other chair of a portfolio committee, and they get adopted. You often hear those that say A, those that they say nay, that type of thing. And so that happens, and then those reports are taken as, you know, having been tabled at the highest level of independent oversight in our parliament. Fast forward to the following year. That year's reports also go through a similar rigor and a similar scrutiny. But the previous year's reports sometimes tend to be forgotten in one way or another. Because before you know it, now in February, there's a State of the Nation address, and this, that, and the other, and suddenly all sorts of things look like they are new priorities, and everybody chases up to those things. And so the reality is that you do not get the sense that after that tabling, for example, in the National Assembly of those reports, and they get adopted as resolutions, you do not get a sense that many of them do get a proper mechanism to follow up on what was actually done in respect with those resolutions. And I think our audit reports fall into that hole, among others. Because then if you had a proper rigor and a proper scrutiny of the resolutions that were taken after SCOPA has had a hearing, for example, let's say on an entity, and there's a resolution that has been put to the House, what we expect is that if you follow through that resolution and make sure that it is implemented, it is among the things that could alleviate the risks that continue to give rise to negative audit opinions. And for us, that I think has been the fault line for the greater part, because the public engagements, you can't say they didn't happen, they did happen. Whether you think they were qualitative or not is a different conversation, but the bottom line is there was a process undertaken between the department or the agency together with the elected representatives that resulted in a resolution. The question is there evidence over the years that many of these resolutions did indeed see the light of day? And the only way they can is when they are returned to those departments to say, in your department in the last year, you had 30 million rands of irregular expenditure, which has been growing over the last 3 years. And the resolution was taken that your budget is going to be impacted one way or another if you continue on this path. The question is, does that level of rigor find expression in the oversight model? And my answer to that is not up to now.
Right, just keeping track of some of the other questions. I don't want to lose them if I can avoid it. Just briefly, a question from James McDade asking, is there somewhere where people can access the complete list of all the transactions that you've declared irregular or wasteful? Anywhere apart from your annual reports and on your website that people can go to?
Well, we do not publicly put it out on the website, but it is in our working papers, because every year we identify irregular expenditure attached to a particular transaction, and we communicate that through our audit report. And so all the cumulative years, if you can go back each of the years we can be able to reconstruct that information, but there's never been a requirement for it to be put out on a public. But it is real information because it is based on real audit tests of transactions undertaken. So it's it is available. It is made available to the ones charged with oversight.
About 2 years ago, 2018, Parliament passed amendments to the Public Audit Act, and they were partly intended to give your office greater powers and sharper teeth. Are you seeing positive consequences? I understand that the Act is being implemented or the amendments are being implemented in phases. Could you perhaps just take us through that a little bit?
You know, Mike, this is one of those things that even ourselves, we as an office were taken by surprise when it all came together. This whole project of proposing the amendment to the Public Audit Act came around 2017. 2017 was that year when the likes of SABC were under direct scrutiny of Parliament, as well as ESCOM during the time. So there was this buzz of the need to strengthen the instruments of oversight. And fast forward to 2018, right up to the beginning of 2019, the amendment was already concluded. And so we had to get an effective date for it. And the effective date of implementation of the amended provision was the 1st of April, 2019. Obviously, the regulations had to come with it, and we did satisfy our committee in Parliament with those regulations. So to implement it, the first phase was then to say, this effective date of 1 April 2019 comes at a time when we were starting to prepare ourselves as an audit office to be ready. Because remember, the implications of these new provisions, which I'm going to deal with, have to be cascaded across all 9 provinces. Now, our teams were never used to dealing with matters the way the amendment proposes. We needed to invest a lot of time to train them, to expose them to different scenarios that will enable them to help identify the matters that this amendment proposes. So we are on that journey. We've done a pilot in the national and provincial departments for the year that ended in 2019, which was about limited to 16 departments. But now we have increased the level of application of these amendments to now cover just about close to 70% of the budget of those entities. That's a huge jump. This year around 2020, there's a huge number of departments that will be subjected to this amendment. What does this amendment say? This amendment says that when you audit the accounts of any department or entity, in addition to your objective, which is to express a fair presentation on the accounts, while you are scrutinizing the books, please look in other areas for evidence of a possible material irregularity. Now, a material irregularity is defined in the amended Public Audit Act as to what it is. It is those instances that would result in somebody claiming to have spent some 20 million on water treatment works, but when the auditors go and see what was delivered, they find something that is equivalent to something like 2 million rands worth of expenditure. That in an audit, when an audit is scrutinizing the books of that particular entity, will be classified as a possible material irregularity. And the provisions that were amended say, once you as an auditor have identified or are suspicious of the existence of a material irregularity, give it to the accounting officer, because that is the highest level of administrative responsibility in any of the areas where we audit. Give it to the accounting officer to explain that transaction within 20 working days while you are busy with the audit. It's no longer a case of we're going to wait for the audit report and dance around the definition of an irregular expenditure and all of that. We're going to point to a particular transaction that we picked up in the books, and we are going to ask the accounting officer to respond within 20 days with evidence If the accounting officer is of the view that we have got it all wrong, the question is, show us in what way have we got it wrong? Show us the evidence to support this expenditure. Because in our view as auditors, we believe it is a material irregularity. It is irregular in the sense that it leads to financial loss to the public institution. So if you've got evidence to suggest otherwise, show it to us. If the accounting officer fails to meet that expected deliverable, because they are the ones, if you look at this PFMA, who are charged with the responsibility to prevent the occurrence of those kind of matters. So if they cannot explain it, then the auditors, in terms of our amended act, are also required to hand it over to investigative agencies who will have better instruments than us as auditors to go deeper into that investigation. It could be the SIU, it could be the public protector, it could be any one of those agencies that are public, they've got public mandates to perform investigations. Because in the past, we never used to do that. We used to just pick it up, the matter, and report on it to, say, a council. And if it comes back and there's evidence that some wrongdoing has happened and has slipped the supervisory systems under the care of an accounting officer, the Auditor-General will be required to issue a binding remedial action with regards to the steps that must be taken to recover that loss. And then the last part of the journey, if all of that fails within the prescribed period, then the Auditor-General is entitled and allowed through the amendment to issue a certificate of debt in the name of an accounting officer or accounting authority for failing to put in place the necessary systems required to prevent occurrences of material irregularities. That's now applicable. The accounts that we are auditing now are going to be coming out with evidence of any material irregularities of that kind. If a department makes a prepayment and has made a prepayment in the financial year towards a service provider who is supposed to deliver to them a particular service or good, and if that prepayment sits in the pocket of the service provider, the accounting officer does not have an explanation, that letter which advises the accounting officer of an existence of a possible material irregularity will also be partly an instruction to the accounting officer to say, well, you paid ahead of receiving the service, go get that money back if you no longer need that service. Or insist that the service provider deliver that which you've paid for. And I think this particular additional provision in the Public Audit Act is about narrowing the space for people who are exercising that responsibility from arguing that they didn't know, or that they take an inordinate amount of time before they react to it. Some of these things, as you have correctly said, in respect to the list of irregular expenditures, many of them go back 2009 in one institution, and every year there is a irregularity that gets added on and on and on and on. With these particular provisions, now it's a case of within a period of 12 months from the date we signed the audit report, we may already have landed at the possibility of a certificate of debt that might be issued to you. And there are all sorts of provisions for natural justice that will come into the picture to make sure that the accounting officer can provide the required answers and explanations should that be their approach to dealing with these matters. So we believe that it's one of the strong instruments, Mike. However, for it to work, it must not only be in the hands of the audit office alone. Those people who are in chair positions of portfolio committees, those that are in scopers in the legislatures and in councils will be favored in their audit reports with a permanent section that deals with the existence or otherwise of material irregularities identified during the audit. They can never say that they didn't know. And that's why we believe that a strong tone at the top in the leadership of these institutions will become an indispensable component of making sure that this audit provision makes for effective application.
Just want to remind everybody, please, to go to the top of the chat box and download that link for the evaluation survey for this. We do really want to know what your feedback will be for this meeting. Mr. Makwetu, you just mentioned strong tone at the top of the organizations, and I'm just looking at this question from Tanya Ajam about the fact that much of the large-scale looting took place in state-owned enterprises, which were audited not by your office, but by private sector auditing firms who appear to have been either incompetent or complicit. Certainly weren't setting the right tone at the top in those instances. Is there a way in which your office responds to this? Is there anything that you can do to encourage accountability from the private sector when it carries out state audits of state entities?
Two things have happened already in that regard. I think we were able to show our true colors at the point when we were confronted by those deficiencies with KPMG as an audit firm. We also did the same with Ngongi, where there were matters circulating in the public domain affecting them as an audit office. So we have used our own instruments, because part of this mandate we don't carry out alone as an audit office. We dish out some work to private audit firms, but they must sign up to some of the fundamental disciplines that we want to adhere to ourselves as an audit office. Part of those, for example, will be to continue to demonstrate that they are investing in independent processes within their institution, that the level of technical competence in doing this kind of work is also not taken lightly. Because in the past, some would take this work and feel the troughs within their cycles, you know, thinking that, this is public sector work, easy, nothing too complicated. You don't have to get your head around complex accounting propositions in some cases and stuff like that. But the key reality here is that this is not our money, it's not your money, it's the public money. There are certain basic rigors that need to be adhered to when you have to audit on our behalf. So we've acted in those situations where we believe that that particular firm didn't come to the party when it came to adhering to some of our disciplines. But over time, we've also been gearing ourselves up, Mike. I mean, as an audit institution, just as a little bit of a marketing, we've got about 600 odd chartered accountants who are permanently resident at the AG's office. If you look at that cohort of professionals, they work not only by themselves, but with other people that are trained in information technology audit, some of whom are also forensic auditors, who come together to bring the best in terms of the risk management disciplines that we put in place. So we've been able then over the years to take on audits like the audit of South African Airways, the audit of South African Post Office, audits of SABC, and most recently we are about to assume full responsibility for the audit of Transnet, among others. And the reason for this is because we do not have the shortage of people with the technical know-how, as well as the disciplines required to infuse the public interest, if you like, into the way that we do this work. Because the difference with us compared to the others that do this work as auditors, we are preoccupied with making sure that the interest of the public is served in the form of the reports that we issue. We do not worry about how much this audit is going to be, because at the end of the year, we don't split up the excess of what we raised in fees between ourselves. We reinvest it into the organization in order to enhance the tools that are at our disposal to do this work effectively. So the risks associated with having to babysit somebody just because you think they're going to give you a contract next year, that doesn't affect us, because the contract is already given to us through that constitutional provision that we must audit these publicly funded institutions. So we kind of get to a point where in relation to the private sector organizations, our investment in the rigors of understanding the different instruments in public institutions have grown significantly over a decade, and the capacities on board are also bigger. Some people tend to say, you bring young people to us who are looking like they are green behind the ears. Well, superficially, they might look green behind the ears, but sit down with them and they start scrutinizing you on the debits and credits. You'll probably think that you are in a theater on fire. That's what we have, and we're not bragging about it, but that's the reality, because we've taken those fees that were paid to us through these public institutions and invested in very strong systems that also produce the same auditors in the future to become chief financial officers in these public institutions. So yeah, we are in the right place, but we do not take kindly when others do work on our behalf and they do less than the required level of competence in the job.
Makwetu, I'm conscious of the time and I don't want to keep you beyond the agreed time, but just maybe a few brief questions still before we wrap up. One of them is relating to the supply chain management regulations under the Municipal Finance Management Act. These require that when tenders are awarded to first-degree relatives of public representatives, that should be footnoted in the annual financial statements of the entity. Has this often been done or not?
What we often do here, Mike, we report on people that have got an exposure where an official in the department is part of the decision-making process, but there are also awards that get given to people related to them or entities where they also have an interest. We do have a reporting responsibility in terms of this. Doesn't necessarily sit in the financial statements as a footnote per se, but it is in the section of our audit report where we specifically comment on it. And every year, what we often do, because the owner of this process, in order to address issues of ethics within supply chain management, is the Department of Public Service and Administration. So we will share that information with them, and I'm sure you would have heard them raising some issues around this matter in the last month or so. And we do try to make sure that at least on our side, we pick up those potential conflicts of interest. And there are many of those, for as long as I said earlier on, nobody takes ownership to deal with them. They sometimes just become a sore point in the organization. Before you know it, in one entity, there would have been none of this. And when it rears its head in year one and nobody acts on it, you can rest assured that it's going to become a feature of this department. Because when people in a department know that there's no real diligence above them to address these matters, they also change their own ways. They may have arrived as the good people at the point when they were employed. And it's when that culture that is allowed to fester in the environment by leadership starts finding expression into the operational environment and the lower levels, that you sometimes find people having more than one order book. So they will say that, yeah, now this week it's our turn to order stationery. And then the others in another section say, no, this week it's our turn to order catering from the suppliers that we know best. And if you allow that at the top level, you can be assured that the cumulative effect of those little supply chain contracts ends up becoming the big irregular expenditure over time. Because everybody knows there's impunity here, nobody acts on anything. But the other reality also, Mike, is that when things happen in departments, the invoices that come from external service providers, they don't go to management. They go to the people in the accounts department, so they see them. They can see what they are paying for. They may be at a lower level in terms of rank, but they can read, and they can see that they are paying an amount for stuff that has got little to do with what their responsibilities and obligations are in the institution. And I think, again, in light of that question that was raised by the other participant regarding leadership, I think if we put in a huge amount of effort in that area, we'll probably find that it's even easier to deal with some of these issues, because when people know that the level of tolerance is limited, if not zero, for these things, then they change their behavior. In the same way that if you look at our amendment to the Public Audit Act, in the past, accounting officers used to know that this particular audit outcome is just going to become a philosophical conversation of a meeting or other. Now that they know upfront that there's a possibility of a certificate of debt in your name with your ID number and an amount for you to make good, people will start thinking differently, for as long as the leadership that they are working for also pursues the same mission.
Good. I'm not going to put any further questions. My apologies to the couple of questions left unanswered in the chat box, but time has caught up with us. I would like to just draw attention to the remarks made there, the comments made by Joan Marie Forbes and Glenn Ho in particular, of thanking Mr. Makwetu for his service as Deputy AG and AG, and the great work that you've done for the country in those capacities. It is, I think, very widely acknowledged and appreciated.